The bitter wind howled across the snow-covered plains of New Mexico territory like an angry spirit, whipping through the frozen branches of cottonwoods and pines as Abigail Price clutched her threadbare shawl tighter around her shoulders. It was December of 1885, and the blizzard that had descended upon the land between Silver City and Hachita had come without warning, transforming the once familiar landscape into a white void that had stolen her sense of direction and, increasingly, her hope of survival. "Just a bit further," Abigail whispered to herself, though her lips were so numb she could barely feel them move. The words disappeared into the howling gale, swallowed by the vast whiteness that pressed in from all sides. The stage coach that had been carrying her to her new position as schoolteacher in Hachita had broken an axle 6 miles back, and the driver had insisted they could walk the remaining distance to town before the weather worsened. That had been yesterday morning, before the driver and the other passenger, a drummer selling patent medicines, had disappeared into the whiteness, their voices fading until Abigail found herself utterly alone. She'd kept walking, or at least she thought she had, though the landmarks she passed began to seem eerily familiar, as if she'd been walking in circles. Her fingers had long since lost feeling, and her feet felt like blocks of ice inside her thin leather boots. The small valise containing all her worldly possessions weighed heavier with each faltering step. 24 years of life, and this was how it would end, frozen in a nameless stretch of wilderness, her body to be found come spring thaw, if at all. The memory of her father's face rose unbidden in her mind. "Too stubborn for your own good, Abby girl," he'd always said, though there had been pride in his voice. She wondered if he would be proud of her now, trudging through snow nearly to her knees, refusing to lie down despite the seductive whisper in her mind that promised rest if she would only stop walking. When she stumbled over something hidden beneath the snow and fell to her knees, Abigail wasn't sure she had the strength to rise again. The cold had seeped into her bones, and exhaustion dragged at her like chains. Perhaps it wouldn't be so bad to rest, just for a moment. "No," she said aloud, her voice cracking from disuse and cold. "Get up, Abigail, get up now." She pushed against the ground with hands she could no longer feel and somehow regained her feet, one step, another, each one a victory against the elements and her own failing body. The wind seemed to be picking up, driving needles of ice against her face, but through the swirling white, Abigail thought she saw something, a shadow, darker than the surrounding storm. "Hello," she called, her voice thin and reedy. "Is anyone there?" The shadow moved, grew larger. A horse's whinny cut through the howl of the wind, and then a massive form materialized out of the blizzard, a horse and rider, both covered in snow. "Miss," a deep voice called. "Good God, what are you doing out here?" Relief made Abigail's knees buckle. The rider dismounted in a fluid motion, crossing the distance between them in long strides. He was tall, his face obscured by a bandana pulled up against the cold, but his eyes, a startling blue even in the dim light of the storm, were wide with concern. "I'm lost," Abigail managed, her teeth chattering violently. "The stage coach broke an axle yesterday morning, yesterday." The man's gloved hands grasped her shoulders. "You've been out in this for a day," Abigail tried to nod, but her body was shaking too hard. She felt herself listing sideways, strength finally abandoning her now that rescue had arrived. Strong arms caught her before she could fall. "I've got you," the man said, his voice close to her ear. In one smooth motion, he swept her up against his chest. "My ranch is nearby. Hold on, miss." "Just hold on." Abigail wanted to thank him, to ask his name, but the world was growing dark at the edges, and the temptation to let go was overwhelming. The last thing she was aware of was being lifted onto the horse, the stranger mounting behind her and pulling her back against his chest, solid and warm. Then something heavy and wonderfully warm was wrapped around her, his coat, and darkness claimed her. When consciousness returned, it came in fragments. Warmth, the crackle of a fire, the smell of coffee and something savory, softness beneath her, rough blankets above. Abigail forced her eyes open, blinking against the light of a lamp on a nearby table. She was in a small but neat cabin, lying on a bed tucked against one wall. A fire blazed in a stone fireplace opposite, and seated in a chair before it was her rescuer. He'd removed his hat and bandana, revealing a face that, while weathered by sun and wind, couldn't have belonged to a man much older than 30. His dark hair was overlong, curling slightly at the ends, and a day's worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He was mending what looked like a bridle, his hands moving with practiced ease. As if sensing her gaze, he looked up, those striking blue eyes finding hers across the room. "You're awake," he said, setting aside his work and rising to his feet. "How do you feel?" Abigail took stock of her body. Her fingers and toes tingled painfully as circulation returned, but nothing felt frozen. "Better than I expected to," she answered honestly, her voice rasping. "How long have I been asleep?" "About 6 hours." He crossed to a stove in the corner and poured something into a mug. "It's nearly midnight. Here, drink this." He approached the bed, and Abigail realized she was wearing only her chemise beneath the blankets. Heat that had nothing to do with the fire flooded her face. The man seemed to read her thoughts. "Your clothes were soaked through." "I hung them to dry by the fire," but he gestured vaguely at a screen set up near the fireplace. "I didn't look. Rancher's honor." Despite everything, Abigail found herself smiling at his discomfort. She sat up, keeping the blankets pulled to her chin, and accepted the mug he offered. The broth was hot and savory, warming her from the inside. "Thank you, Mr. Kendall, Kyle Kendall." He retreated to his chair, giving her space. "My ranch is about 15 miles outside of Hachita." "Abigail Price," she replied. "I was on my way to Hachita to take up a position as the schoolteacher." Kyle's eyebrows rose. "You're the new teacher. Town's been waiting on you for weeks." "I was delayed in Silver City," Abigail explained, sipping more broth. "My father passed away last month. I had to settle his affairs before I could travel. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Price." The words were simple but sincere. "Where were you coming from originally?" "Boston," Abigail said. "My father was a professor at Harvard. After he died, there was little reason to stay." Kyle nodded, not pressing further. "Well, you're lucky I found you when I did. Another hour in that cold and—" He trailed off, his gaze moving to the window where snow still fell heavily. "I've never seen a storm like this in these parts. We're likely snowed in for at least a day or two." Abigail's eyes widened. "I don't want to impose. It's not an imposition," Kyle cut her off gently. "I couldn't very well leave you out there, and I can't very well take you to town now. You'll stay until the storm breaks and the path's clear enough for travel." His tone brooked no argument, and truthfully, Abigail didn't have the energy to protest. She finished the broth, and Kyle took the empty mug, his fingers brushing hers briefly. "You should rest more," he said. "We'll talk in the morning." Abigail nodded, suddenly exhausted again despite her long sleep. As she settled back against the pillows, she saw Kyle adding wood to the fire, his movements economical and sure. "Thank you," she murmured, already drifting, "for finding me, for the coat." Kyle glanced over his shoulder, and for a moment, something unreadable passed across his features. "Get some sleep, Miss Price," he said softly. "You're safe now. That's a promise." The promise followed Abigail into her dreams, wrapping around her more securely than any blanket could. Morning brought a lull in the storm, but no true break. Abigail woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, her stomach growling in response. She sat up to find Kyle at the stove, his back to her as he tended to breakfast. He dressed in fresh clothes, a dark blue shirt and worn denim trousers held up by suspenders, and his hair was damp, as if he'd recently washed it. "Your clothes should be dry," he said without turning. "They're folded behind the screen. I'll step outside while you dress." Before Abigail could thank him, he grabbed his coat from a hook by the door and slipped outside, leaving her alone. She hurried to dress, grateful to find her clothing not only dry but warm from the heat of the fire. Her dress was wrinkled but wearable, though her boots were still damp. She did her best with her hair, plaiting it into a simple braid without the aid of a mirror. When Kyle returned, stomping snow from his boots, Abigail was seated at the small table near the stove. He nodded approvingly. "You look better," he said, hanging his coat and moving to serve breakfast. "Some color in your cheeks. I feel much improved," Abigail assured him, "though I fear my boots may never recover." Kyle set a plate of bacon and eggs before her, along with a steaming mug of coffee. "I might have something that would fit you." Can't have you catching pneumonia when we do make it to town." They ate in companionable silence for a few minutes, Abigail realizing just how hungry she was only when the food was before her. Kyle ate with the efficiency of a man accustomed to viewing meals as necessary fuel rather than an occasion for enjoyment, but his table manners were surprisingly refined for a rancher living alone in the wilderness. "Have you been in New Mexico territory long?" Abigail asked, breaking the silence. Kyle finished chewing before answering. "About 8 years, came west after the war." Abigail did the calculation in her head. If he'd fought in the war between the states, he was older than she'd initially estimated. "You fought for the Union." A corner of Kyle's mouth lifted in what might have been amusement. "Is that a question or an accusation, Miss Price?" Abigail felt heat rise in her cheeks. "A question merely. My father supported the Union cause, though he was too old to fight." Kyle's expression softened slightly. "I was too young, actually. I meant the Apache Wars. I was a scout for the Army for a few years before I purchased this land." "Oh." Abigail felt foolish for her assumption. "I'm afraid I know little about the conflicts with the native peoples here." "Most Easterners don't," Kyle said without judgment. "It's different out here. The land shapes people differently." He glanced toward the window where snow continued to fall, though less heavily than before. "Speaking of which, I need to check on my livestock." "The barn's not far, but in this weather." "Of course," Abigail said quickly. "Please don't let me keep you from your responsibilities." Kyle regarded her for a moment, then nodded. "There are books on that shelf if you get bored," he said, gesturing to a small collection beside the fireplace. "Not much of a library, but it might pass the time." After he'd gone, bundled in his heavy coat and a wool scarf, Abigail explored the cabin. It was sparsely furnished but meticulously clean, with the essentials for comfortable living but few personal touches. The bookshelf held an eclectic collection of few dime novels, some practical manuals on ranching and animal husbandry, a well-worn Bible, and, surprisingly, several volumes of poetry and philosophy that wouldn't have been out of place in her father's study. She selected a volume of Emerson's essays and settled by the fire to read, but her thoughts kept returning to her taciturn host. Kyle Kendall was something of a contradiction, a rough-hewn rancher with the bearing of a gentleman, a solitary man who had nevertheless opened his home to a stranger without hesitation. Abigail found herself wondering about the path that had brought him to this remote place, so far from civilization as she knew it. It was nearly noon when Kyle returned, bringing a blast of cold air and the scent of snow with him. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold, but his expression was grim. "Is something wrong?" Abigail asked, setting aside her book. Kyle removed his coat and hung it carefully, taking his time before answering. "Storm's worse than I thought. Drifts are piling higher than I've seen in years." He ran a hand through his hair, dislodging melting snowflakes. "I'm afraid we're properly snowed in, Miss Price. It could be days before the paths to town clear enough for travel." Abigail's heart sank. She was due to begin teaching after the new year, less than a week away. "Surely there must be some way to reach Hachita." Kyle shook his head. "Not without risking our lives, and I'm not inclined to do that." His eyes met hers, steady and serious. "I know this isn't ideal, but we'll have to wait it out." Abigail nodded slowly, recognizing the truth in his words. After all, she'd nearly died in this storm once already. "I understand," she said quietly. "And I'm grateful for your hospitality, Mr. Kendall, truly." A hint of a smile touched his lips. "Kyle," he corrected her. "If we're to be snowed in together, we might as well use our given names." "Kyle," Abigail repeated, finding she liked the sound of it. "Then you must call me Abigail." "Abigail," he said, and there was something in the way he spoke her name that made her heart beat a little faster. "Now, how about I teach you to play poker to pass the time?" The next few days settled into an unexpected routine. Kyle would rise before dawn to tend to the livestock, returning to share breakfast with Abigail. They would spend the mornings engaged in separate activities, Kyle repairing equipment or attending to ranch business that could be conducted indoors, Abigail reading or helping with household tasks. In the afternoons, they often played cards or engaged in conversation that grew increasingly comfortable as they became more familiar with each other. Abigail learned that Kyle had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith, and had headed west seeking adventure after his parents died of influenza when he was 19. His time as an Army scout had given him an intimate knowledge of the land and its peoples, both white and native. He spoke of the Apache with respect, noting their skill as warriors and their deep connection to the harsh desert landscape. "This land can kill you if you don't respect it," he told her on the third day as they sat before the fire drinking coffee. The Apache understood that. "Most white settlers don't. Is that why you chose to ranch here?" Abigail asked. "Because you respect the land?" Kyle considered the question, his gaze on the flames. "Partly," he admitted. "But mostly because out here, a man is judged by what he does, not who his father was or what school he attended." He glanced at her, his expression softening. "I imagine that's different from Boston." Abigail thought of the rigid social hierarchies of her hometown, the carefully maintained boundaries between classes. "Very different," she agreed. "Though I suspect being a woman presents its own challenges, regardless of location." Kyle's lips quirked in acknowledgement. "Fair point." "Is that why you came west? To escape those challenges?" "Not to escape them," Abigail corrected gently. "To face different ones, perhaps. After my father died, the university offered me a position as a secretary out of respect for him." She couldn't keep the bitterness from her voice. "Despite the fact that I assisted with his research for years, despite my own education." "But you wanted more," Kyle said. It wasn't a question. Abigail nodded. "I saw the advertisement for a teacher in Hachita. New settlement, growing community, seeking educated individual to establish school." She smiled ruefully. "They didn't specify man or woman, and I thought perhaps out here it wouldn't matter as much." Kyle studied her for a long moment, those blue eyes seeming to see more than Abigail was comfortable revealing. "It will matter," he said finally, "but differently. The West has its own prejudices, but it also has its own opportunities. People care more about what you can do than who you're supposed to be." There was something in his tone that suggested personal experience, but Abigail didn't press. Instead, she asked about his ranch, and Kyle spoke with obvious pride about the modest herd of cattle he managed and the horses he bred and trained. He was particularly attached to his stallion, Thunder, the horse that had carried them both through the blizzard. "He's got Arabian blood," Kyle explained. "Makes him smarter than most horses and more stubborn than any mule, but he's steady in a crisis." His expression grew serious. "If he hadn't been willing to push through that storm, I might not have found you in time." The reminder of her near-death experience sent a chill through Abigail despite the warmth of the fire. "I still don't know how to thank you properly," she said quietly. "You saved my life." Kyle looked uncomfortable with her gratitude. Anyone would have done the same. "But it wasn't anyone," Abigail insisted. "It was you, and I," she faltered, suddenly aware of how close they were sitting, of the intensity in his gaze. "I'm very glad it was," she finished softly. Something shifted in Kyle's expression, a flicker of something that might have been longing before he schooled his features and stood abruptly. "I should check on the livestock before dark," he said, his voice gruff. "Storm's finally letting up. We might be able to make it to town tomorrow if the path is clear." He was gone before Abigail could respond, leaving her with the unsettling feeling that she'd crossed some invisible boundary. She returned to her book, but the words blurred before her eyes, her thoughts too scattered to focus. That night, as they shared a simple supper of beans, bacon, and cornbread, the silence between them felt charged in a way it hadn't before. Kyle was more reserved than he had been, answering her questions politely but briefly, his gaze rarely meeting hers. "Have I offended you somehow?" Abigail finally asked, setting down her fork. Kyle looked up, surprise evident in his expression. "No, not at all. Why would you think that?" "You've barely spoken 10 words since you returned from the barn," Abigail pointed out. "If I've said something to upset you, you haven't," Kyle interrupted, his voice gentler. "I'm just—" He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture Abigail had come to recognize as a sign of discomfort. "Tomorrow you'll go to town and begin your new life, and I'll return to mine. It's better if we maintain certain boundaries." Abigail felt a pang of disappointment she wasn't entirely prepared for. I see, she said carefully. You're concerned about propriety. Kyle's mouth twisted in what might have been a smile, among other things. What other things? Abigail pressed, unwilling to let the matter drop. Kyle studied her for a long moment, as if weighing how much to reveal. You're educated, cultured, he said finally. You come from a world of universities and fine society. I'm a rancher with dirt under my fingernails and calluses on my hands. Abigail frowned. I don't see what that has to do with. It has everything to do with it, Kyle cut in, his voice low but intense. In a few weeks, you'll meet someone from town, the banker's son, maybe, or a young lawyer, someone who can offer you the kind of life you're accustomed to. And this, he gestured between them, whatever this might have been, will seem like nothing more than a strange interlude during a blizzard. The assumption stung more than Abigail would have expected. You presume a great deal about what I want or what I'm accustomed to, she said, her voice cooling. For a man who values being judged on his own merits rather than his background, you seem quick to judge me based on mine. Kyle had the grace to look chagrined. That's fair, he admitted after a moment. I apologize. Abigail nodded, accepting the apology but still stinging from his words. They finished the meal in silence, and Abigail retired early, claiming fatigue, though sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. As she lay in the bed that Kyle had insisted she take while he slept on a pallet near the fire, Abigail found herself examining her own reactions. Why had his withdrawal affected her so strongly? She had known him less than a week, yet the thought of parting ways with nothing more than polite gratitude left her feeling hollow. There was something about Kyle Kendall that called to her his quiet strength, his intelligence, the gentleness that tempered his rough edges. In the close quarters of the cabin, she had come to know him in ways that might have taken months in more conventional circumstances. And what she knew, she liked. More than liked if she was honest with herself, but perhaps he was right. Perhaps whatever connection they had formed during the storm was nothing more than circumstance and proximity, a fleeting bond that would dissolve once she took up her position in Hachita. The thought brought no comfort, and Abigail slept poorly, her dreams troubled by howling winds and endless white plains where she searched for something or someone just beyond her reach. Morning brought clear skies and bright sunshine that turned the snow-covered landscape into a dazzling white expanse. Kyle was already up and dressed when Abigail emerged from behind the screen, having changed into her now clean traveling clothes. Weather's broken, Kyle said by way of greeting, pouring her a cup of coffee. Path to town should be passable by midday if we take it slow. Abigail accepted the coffee with a murmured thanks, noting the careful distance Kyle maintained between them. That's good news, she said, though her tone lacked conviction. Kyle nodded, busying himself with breakfast preparations. Town will be relieved to see you safe. I expect they've been worried since the stagecoach failed to arrive. Yes, I suppose they would be. Abigail watched him move around the kitchen, struck by how familiar his routines had become to her in such a short time. Kyle, he paused, glancing at her. Yes. Will you come to town sometimes? I'd like to. That is, I hope we might remain friends. Something flickered in his eyes, regret, perhaps, or resignation. Hachita's a fair ride and the ranch keeps me busy, he said, not quite answering her question. But I do business in town occasionally. It wasn't the response Abigail had hoped for, but she nodded, accepting it for now. They ate breakfast with little conversation, and afterward, Kyle helped Abigail gather her few possessions. Her valise had been recovered along with her, though some of the contents were water-damaged beyond repair. When it came time to leave, Kyle insisted that Abigail wear his spare coat, a heavy woolen garment that was far too large for her but wonderfully warm. I'll get it back next time I'm in town, he said, adjusting the collar around her neck. The gesture was practical, but his hands lingered a moment longer than necessary, and when Abigail looked up, she found his gaze on her face, searching. What is it? She asked quietly. Kyle shook his head slightly. Nothing, he said, stepping back. We should get moving if we want to reach town by evening. They rode double on Thunder, Abigail seated before Kyle, his arms around her to hold the reins. The position was intimate by necessity, and Abigail was acutely aware of his chest against her back, solid and warm despite the cold air around them. The journey to Hachita was slow going. The snow was deep in places, forcing Thunder to pick his way carefully along the trail. Kyle kept up a running commentary about the landmarks they passed, perhaps to distract from the awkwardness of their position, or perhaps simply to pass the time. "That ridge there is where the Apache would watch for travelers," he told her, nodding toward a rocky outcropping to their east. They could see for miles in every direction, made it damned near impossible to surprise them. "You sound almost admiring," Abigail observed. Kyle was quiet for a moment. "They were fighting for their way of life," he said finally, "just as we were fighting for ours. Doesn't mean I can't respect their skill or courage." As they rode, Abigail found herself wondering what Kyle's life was like when he wasn't rescuing stranded schoolteachers. Did he ever get lonely in that remote cabin? Did he regret the choices that had led him to this solitary existence? "Do you have family nearby?" she asked, breaking a companionable silence that had fallen between them. Kyle's answer was slow in coming. "No," he said finally. "No family left. My older brother died at Antietam, though he was fighting for the other side." Abigail couldn't see his face, but she heard the old pain in his voice. "I'm sorry," she said softly. "That must have been difficult. War makes for hard choices," Kyle said, his tone suggesting he didn't wish to elaborate further. "What about you? Any family back in Boston?" "Just an aunt," Abigail said. "My mother's sister. She wanted me to stay to marry a colleague of my father's." She couldn't keep the distaste from her voice. He was nearly 50 and had already buried 2 wives. Kyle's arms tightened fractionally around her. "So you came west instead?" "So I came west," Abigail confirmed. "For adventure, perhaps, or simply for the chance to determine my own future." "A worthy goal," Kyle said, and there was approval in his voice that warmed Abigail more than the heavy coat. They reached Hachita as the sun was setting, the small town gleaming golden in the fading light. It was larger than Abigail had expected, perhaps 3 dozen buildings arranged along a main street, with smaller dwellings scattered beyond. A church steeple rose above the other structures, and several businesses had proper glass windows rather than oilcloth coverings. As they rode into town, their arrival did not go unnoticed. Doors opened, and people emerged to stare at the pair on horseback. A heavy-set man in a sheriff's badge hurried toward them, followed by a woman in a practical dress and apron. "Miss Price," the sheriff called. "My God, we thought you were dead." The stagecoach driver and that drummer fellow staggered into town half-frozen 3 days ago, said they lost you in the storm. Kyle dismounted first, then helped Abigail down with hands that were impersonally courteous. "Found her about 15 miles out," he explained to the sheriff. She'd been walking for a day already. The woman in the apron pushed forward, her round face creased with concern. "You poor dear, you must be half dead with cold and hunger. I'm Martha Wilson, I run the boarding house where you'll be staying." She shot Kyle a suspicious look. "Where have you been keeping her, Kendall?" There was something in her tone that made Abigail bristle. "Mr. Kendall saved my life," she said firmly. "I was lost in the snow for 2 days before he found me. He took me to his ranch and cared for me until the storm passed and the trails were safe again. I owe him my life." Martha looked slightly abashed but not entirely convinced. "Well, you're here now and that's what matters. Come along, dear, let's get you settled." Abigail turned to Kyle, suddenly reluctant to part ways. "Thank you," she said, aware of the inadequacy of the words. "For everything." Kyle nodded, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome, Miss Price. I wish you the best in your new position." The formality stung after the days of easy companionship, but with an audience watching their every move, Abigail understood the necessity. As Martha led her away, Abigail glanced back over her shoulder. Kyle remained where she had left him, tall and straight-backed, watching her go. Their eyes met briefly, and something passed between them unspoken, unnamed but real nonetheless. Then Martha was ushering her into the boarding house, and the moment was gone. The next weeks passed in a blur of activity as Abigail settled into her new role as Hachita's schoolteacher. The school itself was a simple one-room building that doubled as a church on Sundays, but it was clean and well-maintained, with proper desks, and a decent supply of books and materials. Abigail found she enjoyed teaching the mixed group of students, who ranged in age from 6 to 16 and varied widely in their educational backgrounds. Some of the older boys had never had formal schooling at all, while a few of the younger children had been taught by their mothers and could already read simple texts. The town itself proved friendly enough, though Abigail quickly realized that, as a single woman in a frontier community, her every move was subject to scrutiny. Martha Wilson, who proved to be the unofficial guardian of Hachita's moral standards, kept a close eye on Abigail's comings and goings, and there was an unspoken expectation that the new schoolteacher would embody all the virtues expected of a lady. Abigail did her best to meet these expectations while maintaining her independence. She attended church on Sundays, took her meals at the boarding house, and volunteered to help with community events. But she also made it clear that she valued her privacy and would not be subject to constant supervision. "A young lady alone needs guidance," Martha told her over breakfast one morning about 2 weeks after Abigail's arrival. "Especially out here where standards can be relaxed. I appreciate your concern, Mrs. Wilson," Abigail replied evenly, "but I assure you, I'm quite capable of guiding myself." Martha sniffed disapprovingly but said no more on the subject, at least for that day. Throughout these early weeks in Hachita, Abigail found her thoughts returning often to Kyle Kendall. She had half-expected hoped, really, that he would make good on his casual mention of coming to town for business. But as January turned to February with no sign of him, she began to wonder if he had deliberately chosen to stay away. The coat he had lent her hung in her room, cleaned and neatly folded, waiting for its owner to claim it. Sometimes, in the evening, Abigail would run her fingers over the rough wool, remembering the warmth of his arms around her on the ride to town. It was foolish, she told herself, to dwell on a man she had known for less than a week, regardless of the intensity of their shared experience. Kyle had been right, they came from different worlds, and whatever connection she had imagined between them was likely nothing more than gratitude on her part and kindness on his. Still, she found herself watching the road that led into town, and when riders appeared in the distance, her heart would quicken until she could make out their features and confirm that none was the tall rancher with the startling blue eyes. It was nearly the end of February when Martha approached Abigail after Sunday services with news that set her heart racing. "The spring dance is coming up next month," Martha said, straightening her hat. "Committee's meeting tomorrow to plan it. Thought you might like to help, being new to town and all." Abigail, who had been speaking with one of her students' mothers about the girls' progress, turned her attention to Martha. "A dance sounds lovely," she said. "I'd be happy to help." "Good, good," Martha nodded approvingly. "Whole town comes to these things, even folks from the outlying ranches. Good opportunity for you to meet everyone proper like." Abigail's thoughts immediately went to Kyle. Would he attend such an event? "Everyone?" she asked, trying to sound merely curious. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly, as if she could read the direction of Abigail's thoughts. "Most everyone," she amended. "Some folks keep to themselves, of course. That Kendall, for instance, rarely shows his face except to buy supplies or sell livestock." "Oh." Abigail kept her tone deliberately neutral. "He struck me as quite personable." Martha's expression was skeptical. "He's polite enough when he has to be, I'll grant you that. Pays his bills, doesn't cause trouble, but there's something not quite right there." Abigail frowned. "What do you mean?" Martha glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers, then leaned closer. "They say he lived with the Apache for a time after he left the army. Went native, you might say." She lowered her voice further. "Some folks wonder where his true loyalties lie." Anger flared in Abigail's chest. "Mr. Kendall saved my life," she said, her voice cool but firm. "I think that speaks rather clearly about his character." Martha straightened, looking slightly affronted. "Well, yes, of course, I'm just saying he's not quite one of us. Keeps to himself too much. It isn't natural." Before Abigail could formulate a response that wouldn't jeopardize her standing in the community, they were interrupted by the arrival of Thomas Whitfield, the town's banker and one of the most prominent citizens of Hachita. In his late 30s, Whitfield was a widower with 2 young children who attended Abigail's school. He had made his interest in the new teacher clear from her first week in town, calling on her at the boarding house with small gifts and invitations to dine at his home. Abigail had maintained a polite but firm distance, citing her focus on establishing herself in her new position, but Whitfield was persistent in a way that suggested he was accustomed to getting what he wanted. "Miss Price," he greeted her now, doffing his hat. "You look especially lovely today. That blue brings out your eyes." "Thank you, Mr. Whitfield," Abigail replied, accepting the compliment with a small nod. "How are Emma and James? I hope they're practicing their arithmetic." Whitfield waved a hand dismissively. "Oh, I'm sure they're doing whatever you've asked. They speak of nothing but Miss Price says this and Miss Price says that from morning till night." His smile was indulgent, but carried a hint of calculation that made Abigail uneasy. "I was hoping you might join us for dinner this evening. Mrs. Patterson has agreed to prepare one of her excellent roasts." Mrs. Patterson was Whitfield's housekeeper, a stern woman who seemed to view Abigail as a potential disruption to her orderly household. Dinner at the Whitfield home was always a somewhat tense affair, with the banker making increasingly obvious overtures while his housekeeper watched disapprovingly and his children squirmed with boredom. "I'm afraid I must decline," Abigail said, offering what she hoped was an apologetic smile. "I have lessons to prepare for tomorrow." Whitfield's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Surely you must eat, regardless of your preparations," he pressed, "and the children would be so pleased." Martha, who had been watching the exchange with evident approval, chimed in. "You work too hard, dear. An evening of relaxation would do you good." Feeling cornered, Abigail was casting about for another excuse when a commotion near the church entrance caught everyone's attention. A group of men had entered, trail-worn and dust-covered, clearly just arrived in town. Among them, towering over the others, was Kyle Kendall. Abigail's heart leapt at the sight of him, though she was careful to keep her expression neutral. Kyle hadn't seen her yet. He was speaking with Sheriff Davis, his hat held respectfully in his hands. He looked much as she remembered, perhaps a bit leaner, his face more tanned from working outdoors, but the sight of him sent a rush of warmth through her that had nothing to do with the spring sunshine. "Well, speak of the devil," Martha murmured, following Abigail's gaze. "Kendall and his men must be bringing cattle to sell." Whitfield's expression had hardened at the arrival of the newcomers. "Ruffians," he said under his breath. "Davis should make them wait until church services are properly concluded before allowing them to disturb the peace." Abigail bristled at his dismissive tone but held her tongue. Kyle and his men weren't being disruptive. They were simply talking quietly with the sheriff, likely about business matters. As if sensing her attention, Kyle looked up, his gaze sweeping the churchyard until it found her. For a moment, their eyes locked, and Abigail felt a jolt of recognition pass between them. Then Kyle nodded, a brief acknowledgement, his expression giving away nothing of his thoughts. "Mr. Kendall," Abigail called, stepping away from Martha and Whitfield before she could reconsider. "How good to see you in town." Kyle excused himself from the sheriff and approached, his movements easy and confident despite the obvious discomfort of being the center of attention. "Miss Price," he greeted her, his voice formal but warm, "you're looking well. The teaching position agrees with you, I take it?" "Very much so," Abigail confirmed, aware of the curious gazes fixed on them from all sides. "And your ranch, I hope it weathered the winter storms." "Well enough," Kyle said with a slight smile that suggested he understood the necessary superficiality of their exchange. "Lost a few head, but nothing unexpected." Whitfield stepped forward, inserting himself into the conversation with barely concealed irritation. "Kendall," he said, his tone cool. "I understand you're here to sell cattle. I trust you'll be conducting your business and moving on promptly. The town is rather busy preparing for our spring festivities." Kyle's expression cooled, but his manners remained impeccable. "Mr. Whitfield," he acknowledged with a nod. "My men and I will try not to inconvenience anyone unduly. We should conclude our business by tomorrow." Abigail, annoyed by Whitfield's rudeness, spoke before thinking. "But surely you'll stay for the dance, Mr. Kendall. It's in 2 weeks' time." "The whole community is invited." Martha made a small sound of protest, which Abigail ignored. Kyle looked surprised by the invitation, his eyes searching hers as if trying to determine her motivation. "I don't usually attend such gatherings," he said carefully. "Then it's high time you started," Abigail said, lifting her chin slightly in challenge. "After all, you're part of this community, aren't you?" Something flickered in Kyle's eyes, amusement, perhaps, or appreciation for her boldness. "I suppose I am," he conceded. "Perhaps I will attend if my schedule permits." Whitfield's displeasure was palpable, but before he could intervene further, Sheriff Davis called Kyle back to conclude their business. With a brief nod to Abigail and a coolly polite one to Whitfield and Martha, Kyle rejoined his men. "Really, Miss Price," Martha said as soon as Kyle was out of earshot, "it's not appropriate to be quite so familiar with a man like that." "A man like what exactly?" Abigail asked, her tone sharper than she'd intended. "A rancher who saved my life at considerable risk to his own. Who showed me nothing but respect and kindness when I was at my most vulnerable." Martha looked taken aback by the vehemence of Abigail's response. "I only meant, I know exactly what you meant," Abigail cut her off, her patience finally exhausted. "And I would thank you both to remember that while I value your friendship and place in this community, I am quite capable of choosing my own acquaintances." With that, she excused herself, retreating to the boarding house before her temper could lead her to say something truly unforgivable. Only when she was alone in her room did she allow herself to acknowledge the truth she had been avoiding for weeks. Her feelings for Kyle Kendall went far beyond gratitude or friendship. The question was whether he felt anything similar for her, and if so, whether either of them would have the courage to act on it in the face of the town's evident disapproval. Abigail didn't see Kyle again that day or the next, though she heard from her students that the cattle men were staying at the livery stable on the edge of town, conducting business with various merchants and ranchers in the area. She considered seeking him out but hesitated, uncertain of her reception, and aware that such a direct approach would fuel the already active gossip mill. The opportunity to speak with him privately came unexpectedly on the third day, as Abigail was walking home from school in the late afternoon. She had stayed later than usual, preparing materials for the following week's lessons, and the main street was quiet as most people were home preparing their evening meals. As she passed the general store, the door opened, and Kyle emerged, carrying several parcels wrapped in brown paper. He stopped short at the sight of her, and for a moment they simply stood looking at each other. "Miss Price," he said finally, breaking the silence. "Good afternoon." "Mr. Kendall," Abigail replied, suddenly aware that her heart was beating faster. "Are you concluding your business in town?" Kyle nodded, shifting his packages. "Just about. We'll be heading back to the ranch tomorrow morning." "I see." Abigail hesitated, then gestured toward the parcels. "Those look heavy. May I help you carry them?" Kyle's eyebrows rose in surprise. "That's kind of you, but I wouldn't want to impose." "It's no imposition," Abigail assured him, "and actually I've been hoping for a chance to speak with you." At his questioning look, she added, "I still have your coat. I'd like to return it to you before you leave." Kyle's expression softened slightly. "I'd forgotten about that," he admitted. "But there's no rush. You might need it again before spring properly arrives. All the more reason for you to collect it now while you're in town," Abigail countered. "The boarding house is just down the street. It would only take a moment." After a brief hesitation, Kyle nodded. "All right," he agreed, handing her the smallest of his packages. "Lead the way." They walked side by side, keeping a proper distance between them that nevertheless felt artificial after the intimacy of their days together in the cabin. Abigail was acutely aware of the curious glances from the few people they passed, but she held her head high, determined not to give the impression that there was anything inappropriate about their interaction. At the boarding house, Abigail was relieved to find the front parlor empty. "Wait here," she told Kyle. "I'll fetch the coat." When she returned moments later, Kyle was standing exactly where she had left him, his hat in his hands, looking distinctly uncomfortable in the feminine surroundings of Martha Wilson's parlor. He seemed to relax slightly at the sight of Abigail. "Here it is," she said, holding out the neatly folded coat. Cleaned and mended where it was torn, Kyle took it with a nod of thanks. "You didn't have to do that." I wanted to, Abigail said simply. It's the least I could do after everything. A silence fell between them, heavy with unspoken words. Abigail steeled herself and took a deep breath. I meant what I said, about the dance. I think you should come. Kyle's eyes searched hers. Why? He asked quietly. The directness of the question caught Abigail off guard. Because I'd like to see you there, she answered honestly. Because I've missed our conversations. Something flickered in Kyle's expression, surprise, perhaps, or pleasure. Whitfield wouldn't approve, he said, his tone deliberately light. Nor would half the town, I expect. I don't particularly care what they approve of, Abigail said with more heat than she'd intended. Mr. Whitfield has no claim on me, despite what he or others might think. Kyle's lips twitched. So I gathered, he said dryly. You made your feelings on the matter quite clear at the church. Abigail felt her cheeks warm. Was I that obvious? Only to someone who was paying attention, Kyle assured her. He hesitated, then added more seriously. Whitfield is an influential man in these parts. It might not be wise to make an enemy of him. I have no intention of doing so, Abigail said, but neither will I allow him or anyone else to dictate who I may associate with. She met Kyle's gaze directly, including you. Kyle studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You've changed, he said finally, since the storm. There's a certainty in you that wasn't there before. Abigail considered this. Perhaps near death clarifies one's priorities, she suggested. Or perhaps I'm simply becoming the person I was always meant to be now that I'm free to choose my own path. Kyle nodded slowly, as if her words confirmed something he had suspected. Either way, it suits you. He placed his hat on his head, a signal that he was preparing to leave. Thank you for returning the coat, and for the invitation. I'll consider it. It wasn't the commitment Abigail had hoped for, but she nodded, accepting that it was the most she could expect for now. Safe journey home, Mr. Kendall. Kyle, he corrected her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. I think after everything, you've earned the right to use my given name. Kyle, Abigail repeated, savoring the way it felt on her tongue. And you must call me Abigail, at least when we're not in public. Abigail, he said softly, and the sound of her name in his deep voice sent a shiver down her spine. Then he was gone, the front door closing quietly behind him, leaving Abigail alone with the lingering warmth of his presence and the hope that he would indeed attend the dance. The following 2 weeks passed in a blur of preparations for the spring dance. Abigail threw herself into the work with perhaps more enthusiasm than the occasion warranted, volunteering for every committee and task that might distract her from thoughts of Kyle and whether he would make an appearance. Martha Wilson watched these efforts with a mixture of approval and suspicion, clearly pleased by Abigail's involvement in community affairs, but wary of her motives. You're certainly embracing small-town life, she commented one evening as they decorated the town hall with paper streamers and early spring flowers. It's important to be part of the community, Abigail replied neutrally, concentrating on tying a particularly stubborn ribbon. Martha made a non-committal sound. Thomas Whitfield has been asking about you, she said, changing tack with her usual lack of subtlety, wondering if you'll be attending the dance. I imagine most of the town will be there, Abigail said, avoiding a direct answer. It sounds like quite the event. Oh, it is, Martha assured her. Biggest social gathering of the season. People come from miles around. She paused, then added with deliberate casualness. Of course, some folks know better than to show their faces where they're not wanted. Abigail's hands stilled on the ribbon. Is that a warning, Mrs. Wilson? Martha had the grace to look slightly abashed. Just a friendly observation, dear. Some associations can damage a reputation beyond repair, especially for a young woman in your position. My position, Abigail echoed, her voice cooling. As the schoolteacher, Martha clarified. The children look up to you. The parents entrust their little ones to your care. You represent the values and standards of this community. Abigail tied off the ribbon with more force than necessary. I was hired to teach reading, writing, and arithmetic, she said firmly. Not to conform to arbitrary social judgments about who is or isn't acceptable company. Martha drew herself up, affronted. There's nothing arbitrary about it. A man who chooses to live apart from decent society, who consorts with savages. Mr. Kendall served his country, Abigail cut in, her patience finally exhausted. He has built a successful ranch, pays his taxes, and by your own admission, conducts his business honorably. The fact that he prefers solitude to gossip seems to me a point in his favor, not against it. Martha stared at her, momentarily speechless, then her expression hardened. I see, she said coldly. Well, you're young yet. Perhaps experience will teach you what advice cannot. She turned away, effectively ending the conversation, but the tension between them lingered. Abigail knew she had likely damaged her standing with one of the town's most influential women, but she couldn't bring herself to regret defending Kyle. As the day of the dance approached, Abigail found herself wondering if she had made a mistake in issuing the invitation so publicly. What if Kyle felt obligated to attend out of some misplaced sense of chivalry, only to face hostility and discomfort throughout the evening? Or worse, what if he did come, and Abigail discovered that the connection she had felt between them had been nothing but a product of their extraordinary circumstances? The evening of the dance arrived cool but clear, with a canopy of stars visible above Hachita's modest skyline. Abigail dressed with particular care, selecting a gown of deep green silk that she had brought from Boston but had yet to wear in the small town. It was perhaps more elegant than the occasion required, but she found herself wanting to look her best, regardless of whether Kyle appeared. The town hall was transformed by lamplight and decorations, the rough wooden floors swept clean and sprinkled with cornmeal to facilitate dancing. A small group of musicians, a fiddler, a guitarist, and a man with a harmonica were tuning up in one corner, while tables laden with food and drink lined the opposite wall. Abigail arrived early, having volunteered to help with final arrangements, and was immediately swept into a flurry of activity arranging flowers, lighting lamps, and greeting early arrivals. Thomas Whitfield was among the first to appear, resplendent in a new suit that had clearly been ordered from back east. He made a beeline for Abigail, his smile wide and confident. Miss Price, he greeted her, taking her hand and holding it a moment longer than propriety dictated. You look absolutely stunning. That gown, it must have come from Boston. It did, Abigail confirmed, gently but firmly reclaiming her hand. You're looking well yourself, Mr. Whitfield. Thomas, please, he insisted, not for the first time. I've reserved the first dance, if you'll do me the honor. Before Abigail could formulate a polite refusal, Martha Wilson descended upon them, resplendent in purple satin and more jewelry than Abigail had seen since leaving Boston. There you are, Thomas, she said, as if he had been hiding. And Miss Price, how lovely you look, quite sophisticated for our humble gathering. There was a hint of criticism in the words, but Abigail chose to ignore it. You've done a wonderful job with the decorations, Mrs. Wilson, she said instead. The hall looks magical. Martha softened slightly at the compliment. Well, we do what we can out here in the wilderness, she said, with a self-deprecating wave that set her bracelets jingling. Nothing like what you're used to in Boston, I'm sure, but we manage to civilize ourselves once in a while. The doors opened again, admitting a group of ranchers and their families from the surrounding area. Abigail glanced over, her heart quickening, but Kyle was not among them. As more people arrived, the hall began to fill, and the musicians struck up a lively tune that soon had couples taking to the floor. True to his word, Whitfield claimed Abigail for the first dance, leading her through a somewhat stiff waltz while maintaining a steady stream of conversation about his business interests and plans for expanding his home. The East Wing will be completed by summer, he told her as they circled the floor. 4 new rooms, including a proper library. I remember you mentioned a fondness for books. Yes, I do enjoy reading, Abigail acknowledged, wondering how to discourage his obvious intentions without causing offense. I've ordered several volumes from New York, Whitfield continued, oblivious to her discomfort. Classics, poetry, even some of those novels ladies seem to enjoy. I thought perhaps you might help me select more, given your educational background. Before Abigail could respond, the dance ended, and she took the opportunity to excuse herself, pleading a need to check on the refreshments. Whitfield released her reluctantly, with a promise to seek her out for another dance later. As the evening wore on, Abigail danced with several partners: the sheriff, a few of her students' fathers, even the town doctor, a kindly older man who had been among the first to welcome her to Hachita. But her gaze kept returning to the door, hope fading with each new arrival who wasn't Kyle. She was helping to replenish the punch bowl when a sudden hush fell over the crowd near the entrance. Abigail looked up to see Kyle Kendall standing in the doorway, tall and imposing in a suit that, while not new, fit his broad shoulders perfectly. He had trimmed his hair and beard, and there was something almost defiant in the way he held himself, aware of the stares but refusing to be cowed by them. Abigail's heart leapt at the sight of him. He had come, despite everything, despite the town's disapproval, despite his own reservations, despite the distance he had tried to maintain between them. He had come. Kyle's eyes scanned the room, passing over the gawking faces until they found Abigail. For a moment, he simply looked at her, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. Then he nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement that felt intensely private despite the public setting. Martha Wilson was the first to recover from the shock of his arrival. With a visible effort at hospitality, she approached him. "Mr. Kendall," she said, her voice carrying in the suddenly quiet hall. "This is unexpected, Mrs. Wilson," Kyle replied evenly. "I was invited, I believe." Martha's smile was strained. "Of course, everyone is welcome. Please help yourself to refreshments." Kyle nodded politely and moved further into the hall. Conversations gradually resumed, though with an undercurrent of whispers and glances in his direction. Abigail remained where she was, uncertain whether to approach him directly or wait for him to come to her. The decision was made for her when Thomas Whitfield appeared at her elbow, his expression thunderous. "What is he doing here?" he demanded in a low voice. "The same thing as everyone else, I imagine," Abigail replied calmly. "Enjoying an evening of music and dancing." Whitfield's jaw tightened. "That man has no place among decent folk," he said. Not after, he broke off, glancing around to ensure they weren't overheard. "After what exactly?" Abigail pressed, her patience wearing thin with the constant hints and whispers. Whitfield hesitated, then leaned closer. "They say he went native during his time with the Apache," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Took one of their women as his companion. Some even say there was a child." Abigail stared at him, momentarily speechless. If true, it would explain much about Kyle's isolation and the town's attitude toward him, but it changed nothing about her own feelings. "And this makes him unworthy of basic courtesy?" she asked finally. Whitfield looked affronted. "It makes him unfit company for a lady," he said firmly. "Especially one in your position. My position as a thinking, feeling human being capable of forming my own judgments," Abigail suggested, her tone deceptively sweet. "Or my position as a potential addition to your household, Mr. Whitfield." Whitfield drew back as if slapped. "I have only your best interests at heart," he insisted, though his expression suggested wounded pride rather than genuine concern. "Then I thank you for your concern," Abigail said, "but assure you it is unnecessary. Now, if you'll excuse me, I believe I see a former acquaintance I should greet." Before Whitfield could respond, Abigail moved away, threading through the crowd toward Kyle, who stood alone near one of the windows, a glass of punch untouched in his hand. He straightened as she approached, his eyes taking in her appearance with evident appreciation. "You came," Abigail said simply, stopping before him. "I said I would consider it," Kyle replied, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "And I considered that I would rather see you dance than sit alone at my ranch wondering if you were dancing with Whitfield." The admission, casual though it was delivered, sent a flutter through Abigail's chest. "I've danced with several partners," she said, "but I've been waiting for one in particular." Kyle's eyebrows rose slightly. "Is that so, MMM?" Abigail hummed in confirmation. "You see, I owe him rather a lot. My life, for one thing, and the temporary use of a very warm coat for another." A genuine smile broke across Kyle's face, transforming his features in a way that made Abigail's breath catch. "Sounds like a man worth waiting for," he said, playing along. "I thought so," Abigail agreed. Though I was beginning to worry he wouldn't appear, Kyle's expression grew more serious. "It's not easy," he said quietly, "stepping into a place where you know you're not welcome." Abigail's heart ached at the simple truth of his words. "You're welcome where I am," she said, meeting his gaze directly. "Always." Something flashed in Kyle's eyes: surprise, gratitude, and perhaps something deeper. Before he could respond, the musicians began a new tune, a slower waltz that cleared the floor of all but the most confident dancers. "Would you dance with me, Kyle?" Abigail asked, suddenly bold. "Or would that be asking too much?" Kyle set down his untouched punch. "It would be my honor," he said formally, offering his arm. As they moved onto the dance floor, Abigail was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Kyle's hand was warm at her waist, his other clasping hers with gentle firmness. He moved with surprising grace for such a large man, guiding her through the steps of the waltz with confident ease. "You dance well," Abigail observed, looking up at him. Another unexpected talent. A corner of Kyle's mouth lifted. "My mother insisted," he said. "Said no son of hers would grow up without knowing how to properly escort a lady across a dance floor. She taught you well," Abigail said softly. "I'm sorry you lost her so young." Kyle's expression softened at the mention of his mother. "She was a remarkable woman," he said, "strong like you. Unafraid to defy convention when she believed in something or someone." The comparison warmed Abigail more than she could express. "I think I would have liked her," she said. "She would have liked you," Kyle replied with certainty. "Very much." They danced in silence for a moment, the music weaving around them, creating a private space within the public gathering. Abigail was conscious of Kyle's every breath, every slight adjustment of his hand at her waist, every meeting of their eyes. "People are talking," she said finally, not because she cared, but because she wanted him to know that she didn't. "People always talk," Kyle replied, his voice low and unconcerned. "Especially in small towns with little else to occupy them. Does it bother you?" Abigail asked. "What they say about you?" Kyle was quiet for a moment, considering. "It used to," he admitted. "When I first came back. Now, I've made my peace with it. A man can't control what others think of him, only how he conducts himself." "That's a remarkably philosophical perspective," Abigail observed. Kyle's lips quirked in a half-smile. "I have a lot of time to think out at the ranch," he said dryly, "and quite a few books, despite what some might believe about my level of civilization." The music was drawing to a close, and Abigail felt a pang of regret that their time together was ending. "Would you walk me outside?" she asked impulsively. "Just for a moment, I could use some fresh air." Kyle hesitated, clearly aware of how such a request might be interpreted by the watching crowd. "Are you sure?" he asked quietly. "It might give people the wrong idea." "Or the right one," Abigail countered, meeting his gaze steadily. Something shifted in Kyle's expression: surprise, followed by a dawning realization. "Abigail," he said, her name a question in itself. "Please," she said simply. After a moment's consideration, Kyle nodded. "For a moment," he agreed, offering his arm once more. They made their way off the dance floor and toward the door, ignoring the stares that followed their progress. Outside, the night was cool and clear, the stars brilliant above them. A few couples were taking the air along the boardwalk, but Kyle led Abigail around the side of the building to a small garden area where they could speak privately. "You're playing a dangerous game," he said without preamble once they were alone. "Whitfield is already watching us like a hawk, and half the town is likely speculating on your virtue as we speak." "Let them," Abigail said, her voice steady despite the rapid beating of her heart. "I'm tired of living my life according to others' expectations." Kyle studied her face in the dim light spilling from the hall's windows. "What are your expectations, Abigail?" he asked softly. "What do you want?" It was the question she had been asking herself for weeks, and now, face to face with the man who had occupied so many of her thoughts, Abigail found the courage to answer honestly. "I want to know if what I felt during those days in your cabin was real," she said. "If the connection between us was more than just circumstance and proximity and gratitude." Kyle's breath caught audibly. "And if it was?" he asked, his voice rough with an emotion Abigail couldn't quite identify. "What then?" "Then I want to explore it," Abigail said simply. Without the town's judgment or Whitfield's interference or Martha Wilson's disapproval. Kyle shook his head slowly, though not in refusal. You don't know what you're asking, he said. The rumors about me, I don't care about rumors, Abigail interrupted. I care about the man who found me in a blizzard, who wrapped me in his coat and brought me to safety, who treated me with nothing but respect and kindness when I was at my most vulnerable. There's more to it than that, Kyle insisted. Things about my past that you don't know. Then tell me, Abigail challenged. Tell me the worst of it and let me decide for myself. Kyle was silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable in the shadows. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. After I left the army, I stayed with the Apache for almost a year, he began. I had been a scout, had learned their language, earned a measure of trust with some of the leaders. When my enlistment ended, I was lost. The war had changed everything I knew, killed my brother, destroyed the world I grew up in. The Apache offered a different way of living, a different perspective. He paused, watching her face for a reaction, but Abigail simply nodded encouragingly. There was a woman, Kyle continued after a moment. Nianoka, she was a widow with a young son. We became close. You loved her, Abigail said softly. It wasn't a question. Kyle closed his eyes briefly. I did, he acknowledged. We lived as husband and wife, though no formal ceremony was performed. Her son, Tarak, became like my own child. What happened to them? Abigail asked, sensing the pain beneath his carefully controlled narrative. Kyle's jaw tightened. The army decided the Apache needed to be contained, he said, a bitter edge entering his voice. Rounded up and moved to reservations. Our village was given an ultimatum: surrender or be considered hostile. The chief wanted to fight. I argued for surrender, believing promises of fair treatment. His voice faltered for the first time. I was wrong. Abigail reached out impulsively, taking his hand in hers. Kyle looked down at their joined hands for a moment before continuing. The soldiers who came weren't interested in peaceful surrender. There was a misunderstanding. Shots were fired. Nianoka was killed trying to protect Tarak. His voice was flat now, emotionless. I got the boy out, took him to relatives in another band, then I left the territory for a time. When I returned, I bought land as far from the army and the reservations as I could manage, built my ranch. Kept to myself. And the townspeople know this story, Abigail asked. Parts of it, Kyle said. Enough to decide I'd gone native and couldn't be trusted. Some of the rumors are worse than the truth, that I participated in raids, that I turned against my own kind. Others are simply exaggerations of what actually happened. He withdrew his hand from hers gently but firmly. So now you know, he said, his voice quiet but challenging. Still think you want to explore a connection with a man the town considers little better than a renegade? Abigail considered her words carefully before responding. I think, she said slowly, that you endured a terrible tragedy, that you loved and lost and carried that pain with you, that you tried to do what was right in an impossible situation. She met his gaze directly. None of that makes you unworthy of happiness, Kyle, of connection, of love. The word hung between them, charged with possibility. Kyle stared at her, his expression a complex mixture of disbelief, hope, and fear. You can't know what you're saying, he said, though there was less conviction in his voice. The town would never accept. I'm not asking the town, Abigail interrupted firmly. I'm asking you, do you feel something for me, Kyle? Beyond gratitude for having someone to rescue, beyond the circumstances that brought us together, Kyle's resistance visibly crumbled. Yes, he admitted, the word seeming to be torn from him. God help me, yes. From the moment I found you in that storm, half frozen but still fighting to survive. From every conversation we had in that cabin, every glimpse I saw of your mind, your heart. He took a step closer, his voice dropping. From the way you looked at me just now on that dance floor, as if I were the only man in the room worth seeing. Joy bloomed in Abigail's chest, bright and fierce. Then that's all that matters, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her. The rest is just details. Kyle gave a short, disbelieving laugh. Details, he echoed. Abigail, your reputation is my concern, not yours, she said firmly. I'm not asking you to make any declarations or promises. I'm simply asking for Time to see where this might lead without the constraints of what others expect or demand. Kyle studied her face as if searching for any sign of doubt or hesitation. Finding none, he reached up slowly, his hand hovering near her cheek before gently, oh so gently, cupping it in his palm. "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Abigail leaned into his touch, her eyes never leaving his. "Is that a yes?" she asked softly, the corner of Kyle's mouth lifted in a reluctant smile. "It's a God help us both," he corrected. "But yes, I want to see where this leads to." Before either of them could say more, the door to the hall opened nearby, spilling light and music into the garden. Kyle stepped back quickly, dropping his hand from Abigail's face, but not before Martha Wilson, emerging with another woman, caught sight of their intimate position. "Miss Price." Martha called, her voice sharp with disapproval. "Is that you? Are you quite all right?" Abigail straightened her shoulders, turning to face the older woman with composure she didn't entirely feel. "Perfectly fine, thank you, Mrs. Wilson," she replied evenly. "Mr. Kendall was just telling me about the stars. Did you know he learned the Apache names for many of the constellations during his time as a scout? Fascinating cultural knowledge." Martha looked between them suspiciously, clearly not believing this innocent explanation but unable to openly accuse them of impropriety. "How? Educational," she said finally. "But perhaps such lessons would be better conducted in a more public setting. People might get the wrong impression." "People often do," Kyle said, his voice mild but with an edge of steel beneath, "particularly when they're looking for reasons to think the worst." Martha bristled visibly but maintained her composure. "The next dance is starting," she said to Abigail, ignoring Kyle's comment. "Thomas has been looking for you. Please tell Mr. Whitfield I'll be in shortly," Abigail said politely but firmly. "I'm enjoying the fresh air for a moment longer." Martha hesitated, clearly reluctant to leave them alone, but her companion was already moving back toward the entrance, and social convention prevented her from staying without appearing to chaperone them deliberately. "Very well," she said stiffly. "Don't linger too long, the night air can be dangerous to one's health." With that parting shot, she retreated, though Abigail had no doubt she would be watching the door for their return. "She'll have the whole town talking by morning," Kyle observed, though he seemed more resigned than concerned. "Let them talk," Abigail said, surprising herself with her own defiance. "I'm tired of living my life to please others." She turned to Kyle, her decision made. "When will you return to town?" Kyle considered. "I need to bring some horses to sell next month," he said. "Mid-April likely." Abigail nodded, formulating a plan. "I'll write to you," she said. "General delivery at the post office. Nothing that would raise eyebrows if read by others, but a way to stay connected." Kyle's expression softened. "I'd like that," he said. Then, with obvious reluctance, "We should go back inside before Mrs. Wilson sends a search party." Abigail knew he was right, but she was loath to end this moment of private understanding. "One more thing," she said impulsively. Would you kiss me, Kyle? Just once, before we have to return to pretending for everyone else." Kyle's eyes widened in surprise, then darkened with something that made Abigail's pulse quicken. "That would be very improper," he said, though he was already stepping closer. "I know," Abigail admitted, tilting her face up to his. "I find I don't care." Kyle's laugh was soft and wondering. "Remarkable," he murmured again, and then his lips were on hers, gentle at first, then with growing confidence as Abigail responded eagerly. The kiss was brief but perfect a promise, a beginning, a declaration more eloquent than words. When they parted, Abigail felt as if something fundamental had shifted within her, as if a path she hadn't known she was seeking had suddenly opened before her. "We should go back," Kyle said, his voice rougher than before. "Separately, I think." Abigail nodded reluctantly. "You first," she suggested. "I'll follow in a few minutes." Kyle hesitated, then lifted her hand to his lips in a gesture both formal and intimate. "Until April," he said softly. "Until April," Abigail echoed, watching as he straightened his jacket, assumed an expression of careful neutrality and strode back toward the hall entrance. Left alone in the garden, Abigail pressed her fingers to her lips, still tingling from Kyle's kiss. The path ahead would not be easy. She had no illusions about the challenges they would face from the town, from Whitfield, from the weight of Kyle's past, and her own uncertain future. But for the first time since the blizzard, she felt truly warm, as if the promise Kyle had made when he wrapped her in his coat had been fulfilled in ways neither of them could have imagined. With a deep breath, Abigail smoothed her skirts, checked that her hair was still properly arranged, and prepared to face the curious stares and whispers that awaited her inside. Let them talk, she thought again, straightening her shoulders. Some things were worth any price. The spring turned to summer, and Hachita bloomed under the southwestern sun. Abigail found herself settling into life in the small town despite the challenges, or perhaps because of them. Her students continued to progress, their initial wariness of the Eastern lady giving way to genuine affection and respect. Even Martha Wilson had softened somewhat in her attitude, though she remained vigilant about Abigail's social activities and continued to promote Thomas Whitfield as an ideal match. Whitfield himself had become increasingly persistent in his attentions, seemingly spurred rather than deterred by Abigail's polite but firm rejections. He called at the boarding house regularly, sent gifts that grew more expensive and harder to refuse, and made it clear to anyone who would listen that he considered the new schoolteacher the perfect future Mrs. Whitfield. Through it all, Abigail maintained her composure and independence, neither encouraging Whitfield's pursuit nor allowing it to curtail her activities. She had made friends among the younger women in town, particularly Sarah Jensen, the doctor's daughter, who shared Abigail's love of books and independent spirit, and beneath the surface of her daily life ran a current of anticipation and secret joy, for Kyle had kept his word. Once a month, he came to town on business, and each visit included at least one moment of private conversation, a chance meeting on a side street, a brief exchange in the general store when no one else was present, once even a stolen half-hour in the schoolhouse after classes had ended for the day. Between these precious encounters, they exchanged letters cautious at first, then increasingly open as they gained confidence in the discretion of Hachita's postmaster. Kyle wrote of his daily life on the ranch, the challenges and satisfactions of working the land, his observations of the changing seasons. Abigail responded with stories of her students, her adjustments to small town life, and her growing sense of purpose in her role as educator. Gradually, their letters deepened, sharing thoughts, memories, hopes for the future. Kyle told her more about Neonoka and Tarak, about the guilt he still carried for their fate. Abigail wrote of her father's death, her mother's passing years earlier, her sense of being unmoored from all that had once defined her. "I understand now why you came west," Kyle wrote in one letter that Abigail had read so many times the paper was soft with handling. "There's a freedom in reinvention, in building a life from the raw materials of who you truly are rather than who others expect you to be. You're braver than I was. I ran from my past, but you ran toward your future." It was in late July, during one of Kyle's monthly visits to town, that everything changed. Abigail had arranged to meet him at the livery stable, where he was negotiating the sale of 2 horses he had trained. The livery owner, Jakob Mueller, was one of the few people in town who treated Kyle with unqualified respect, valuing his skill with horses above any rumors about his past. Abigail arrived just as Jakob was leading the horses into a back corral, leaving Kyle alone in the main stable. He looked up at her approach, his face lighting with a smile that still made her heart skip a beat. "Right on time," he said, wiping his hands on a cloth. "Jakob's just taking the horses back to show his son. We have a few minutes." Abigail glanced around to ensure they were truly alone, then stepped closer, allowing Kyle to pull her into a brief embrace. These stolen moments of physical contact were rare and precious, carefully rationed to avoid discovery. "I've missed you," she admitted, breathing in the scent of him horses, leather, sun-warmed skin. "Your letters help, but they're not the same." Kyle's arms tightened around her fractionally before he released her, mindful of the risk of discovery. "I know," he said softly. "I count the days between visits. It's not easy." Abigail stepped back, putting a proper distance between them despite her desire to remain close. "I've been thinking," she began, her heart racing with what she was about to propose. "The school term ends in August. I'll have nearly a month before classes resume in October." Kyle's eyebrows rose slightly. "And," he prompted when she hesitated, "and I thought perhaps I might visit your ranch," Abigail said in a rush. "Properly, I mean, during daylight with a chaperone if necessary. Sarah Jensen has agreed to accompany me if I asked. Her father trusts her judgment and she's sympathetic to our situation." Kyle stared at her, surprise evident in his expression. "You've discussed this with Sarah?" he asked carefully. "Not in detail," Abigail assured him. "But she's guessed much of it. She's very observant and she doesn't share the town's prejudice against you." She took a deep breath. "I want to see where you live, Kyle, not as a half-frozen refugee, but as someone who cares for you, who wants to understand your world." Kyle was silent for a long moment, considering. "It would cause talk," he said finally, "even with a chaperone." "There's already talk," Abigail pointed out, "has been since the dance. At least this way, we'd have a chance to spend more than stolen moments together." Kyle ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Abigail had come to recognize as a sign of internal conflict. "What about Whitfield?" he asked. "He's not likely to take kindly to you visiting another man's home, chaperone or no." Abigail's expression hardened slightly. "Mr. Whitfield has no claim on me," she said firmly. "I've made that abundantly clear, both to him and to anyone else who cares to listen." "That doesn't mean he'll accept it gracefully," Kyle warned. "Men like Whitfield aren't accustomed to being refused what they want." "All the more reason not to give him what he wants," Abigail countered. She softened her tone. "I'm not asking for anything improper, Kyle, just a chance to see your ranch, to spend time together without constantly looking over our shoulders." Kyle's resistance visibly wavered. "When?" he asked, the single word an admission of defeat. Abigail smiled, relief and anticipation flooding through her. "The school term ends on August 18th, she said. "Perhaps the following weekend. That would give me time to make arrangements with Sarah." Kyle nodded slowly. "I'll send the wagon for you," he said. "It's too far to ride in a day, especially for someone not accustomed to the saddle. You can stay overnight and return the following day." Before Abigail could respond, the sound of approaching footsteps alerted them to Jakob's return. They stepped apart casually, Abigail moving to examine one of the saddles hanging nearby as if it had been the purpose of her visit all along. "Fine animals, those two," Jakob said as he entered, apparently unsurprised to find Abigail there. "Worth every penny, Kendall." Kyle nodded his thanks for the compliment. "Miss Price was just asking about riding lessons," he said smoothly. "I suggested she might speak with you about a gentle mount suitable for a beginner." Jakob's eyes twinkled with what might have been amusement or understanding. "Of course," he agreed readily. "Always happy to help a lady improve her riding skills. Never know when they might come in handy." Abigail felt her cheeks warm at the potential double meaning but maintained her composure. "Thank you, Mr. Mueller," she said. "Perhaps we could discuss it another time. I should be getting back to the boarding house." "Of course, Miss Price," Jakob said genially. "Any time that suits you." With a nod to both men, Abigail took her leave, her heart lighter than it had been in weeks. The plan was set. In less than a month, she would see Kyle's ranch, spend real time with him without the constraints of Hachita's watchful eyes. It was a small step, perhaps, but a significant one toward whatever future they might build together. As August drew to a close, Abigail found herself counting the days until her planned visit to Kyle's ranch with an eagerness she could barely conceal. Sarah Jensen had readily agreed to accompany her, more excited about the adventure than concerned about propriety. "It's about time someone in this town had the courage to live on their own terms," Sarah had declared when Abigail confided in her. "And Kyle Kendall is worth 10 of Thomas Whitfield, if you ask me." The visit was set for the weekend following the end of the school term, with Kyle's ranch hand, Miguel, to drive them out on Saturday morning and return them to town on Sunday afternoon. Abigail had prepared a plausible story about wanting to see more of the surrounding countryside before the fall term began. And while Martha Wilson had looked skeptical, she hadn't openly objected. 3 days before the planned excursion, however, disaster struck. Abigail was grading the final examinations in her classroom when the door opened without a knock, admitting Thomas Whitfield. His expression was thunderous, his normally immaculate appearance slightly disheveled, as if he had hurried to find her. "Mr. Whitfield," Abigail greeted him, setting down her pen. "This is unexpected." Whitfield closed the door behind him with deliberate care. "Is it?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "I would have thought you might anticipate my visit, given the circumstances." Abigail's pulse quickened with apprehension, though she maintained her outward calm. "What circumstances would those be?" Whitfield approached her desk, placing his palms flat on its surface and leaning forward. "Don't play the innocent with me, Abigail," he said, using her given name for the first time. "I know about your planned excursion to Kendall's ranch." Abigail felt the blood drain from her face but forced herself to meet his gaze steadily. "I wasn't aware my personal plans were subject to your approval or knowledge, Mr. Whitfield. They become my concern when they affect the reputation of this town's schoolteacher," Whitfield snapped. "A position, may I remind you, that is dependent on the continued support of the town council, of which I am a prominent member." The threat was unmistakable. Abigail rose from her chair, unwilling to remain seated while Whitfield loomed over her. "Are you suggesting that my position is at risk because I choose to visit an acquaintance's home in the company of a respectable chaperone?" she asked, her voice cool despite the anger building within her. "An acquaintance," Whitfield repeated with obvious skepticism. "Is that what you call Kendall? A man who lived with savages, who took one as his wife, who betrayed his own kind?" "Those are rumors and distortions," Abigail said firmly. "Mr. Kendall served his country honorably. What happened afterward was a tragedy, not a betrayal." Whitfield straightened, studying her with narrowed eyes. "You defend him with remarkable passion for someone claiming mere acquaintance," he observed. "One might almost think there was something more between you." Abigail lifted her chin. "What might be between Mr. Kendall and myself is none of your concern," she said, abandoning pretense. "I have never encouraged your attentions, Mr. Whitfield, nor given you any reason to believe you have a claim on my affections or my future." Whitfield's face flushed with anger. "I have shown you nothing but respect and generosity," he said, his voice rising. "Offered you a position in society that a woman in your circumstances should be grateful to attain, and this is how you repay me, by carrying on with a man barely better than a savage himself." Abigail's own temper flared. "I owe you nothing," she said coldly. "Not gratitude, not affection, and certainly not obedience to your wishes. I am a free woman, Mr. Whitfield, not a possession to be claimed or a prize to be won." For a moment, Whitfield looked genuinely taken aback by her vehemence. Then his expression hardened. "You're making a grave mistake," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Kendall is not the man you think he is, and you will find that in a town like Hachita, no one stands alone for long. Not even the schoolteacher." He turned to go, then paused at the door. "The town council meets tomorrow evening to discuss the fall term," he added over his shoulder. "I suggest you reconsider your plans before then, for your own sake." The door closed behind him with a finality that sent a chill down Abigail's spine. She sank back into her chair, her hands trembling with a mixture of anger and fear. Whitfield's threat had been explicit: continue her association with Kyle, and her position as teacher would be jeopardized. For a moment, doubt assailed her. Was she truly prepared to risk everything she had built in Hachita for a relationship that was still in its early stages? Could she justify such a sacrifice, not only for herself but for her students, who had come to rely on her? But as the initial shock of Whitfield's visit wore off, Abigail's resolve strengthened. If her position was dependent on submitting to the personal demands of a man like Whitfield, perhaps it wasn't a position worth keeping. And if the town valued his wealth and influence over basic decency and fairness, perhaps it wasn't a community she wished to serve after all. With sudden clarity, Abigail knew what she had to do. Gathering her things quickly, she left the schoolhouse and headed not for the boarding house but for the livery stable. Jakob Mueller was grooming a mare in the front stall when she arrived, slightly breathless from her hurried walk. Miss Price, he greeted her with surprise. Twice in 1 week. To what do I owe the pleasure? I need to send a message to Kyle, Abigail said without preamble. It's urgent. Is there someone who could ride out to his ranch today? Jakob's bushy eyebrows rose, but he asked no questions. My boy could go, he said after a moment's consideration. He's quick on a horse, knows the way, but it'd be near dark by the time he reached Kendall's place. That's fine, Abigail said. I just need to get word to him as soon as possible. I'll pay whatever is customary for the service. Jakob waved away her offer. No charge for friends, he said simply. Write your message. My boy will see it delivered. Abigail thanked him with genuine gratitude, accepting the pencil and paper he offered. She hesitated only briefly before writing, K plans discovered. Whitfield threatens my position if visit proceeds. Council meets tomorrow evening. Will not be intimidated, but believe you should be aware. Tell Miguel not to come as arranged. I will find another way. She folded the note carefully and handed it to Jakob, who promised to send his son immediately. As Abigail turned to leave, the livery owner called after her. Miss Price, he said, his weathered face serious. Whitfield's not a man who takes kindly to being crossed. Be careful. Abigail nodded, touched by his concern. Thank you, Mr. Mueller, she said. I will. The following day passed in a haze of tension as Abigail waited for the town council meeting that evening. She had no doubt that Whitfield would make good on his threat, but she was determined to face whatever came with dignity and conviction. To her surprise, a message arrived for her at the boarding house in the late afternoon, not from Kyle, as she had half expected, but from Sheriff Davis, requesting her presence at the council meeting. Abigail read the brief note twice, trying to discern its implications, but the sheriff's formal language revealed nothing of his intentions or the council's mood. Martha Wilson, who had delivered the message, watched Abigail's reaction with barely concealed curiosity. Trouble at the school. She asked, attempting to sound casual. Not that I'm aware of, Abigail replied evenly, though I understand the council is meeting to discuss the fall term. Martha nodded, her expression thoughtful. Thomas Whitfield stopped by early this morning, she said, studying Abigail's face. He seemed disturbed about something. Abigail maintained her composure, though inwardly she tensed. Did he? She asked mildly. How concerning for him. Martha's eyes narrowed slightly at Abigail's non-response. He's a good man, she said pointedly. Respected in this community. A woman could do far worse. Indeed, Abigail agreed neutrally. A woman could also do far better than to marry a man she doesn't love, regardless of his standing in the community. Martha looked as if she might argue further, but something in Abigail's expression must have dissuaded her. The council meets at 7, she said instead. Don't be late, they don't like to be kept waiting. At precisely 6:45, Abigail presented herself at the town hall, dressed in her most professional attire, a navy blue skirt and jacket over a crisp white blouse, her hair neatly arranged in a simple chignon. She had debated wearing her finest dress but decided against it. This was not a social occasion but a professional reckoning, and she would meet it on those terms. The town council consisted of 5 members: Mayor Anderson, a mild-mannered former shopkeeper, Dr. Jensen, Sarah's father, Thomas Whitfield, Jacob Mueller, whose presence gave Abigail a small measure of comfort, and Martha Wilson, the only female member who had been elected largely on the strength of her late husband's reputation as a founding citizen of Hachita. They were already seated at a long table at the front of the hall when Sheriff Davis escorted Abigail in. A small audience occupied the chairs facing the council, mostly parents of Abigail's students and a few other town notables. Abigail was directed to a single chair positioned directly before the council table, a placement that felt uncomfortably like standing in the dock. Mayor Anderson called the meeting to order with a perfunctory bang of his gavel. We're here to discuss certain concerns that have been raised regarding the conduct of our schoolteacher, Miss Abigail Price, he announced, his discomfort evident in his refusal to meet Abigail's eyes. Mr. Whitfield has brought these concerns to our attention and wishes to address them publicly. Whitfield rose, straightening his jacket with a self-important gesture that might have been comical under other circumstances. "Thank you, Mayor," he said, his voice carrying easily in the quiet hall. "As you all know, when we hired Miss Price last winter, we did so based on her credentials and the understanding that she would uphold the moral standards this community expects from those entrusted with the education of our children." He paused, allowing his words to settle. "It has come to my attention, however, that Miss Price has been engaging in behavior that falls well short of those standards. Specifically, she has been conducting a relationship of an inappropriate nature with Kyle Kendall, a man whose own moral character and loyalty to this community have long been in question." A murmur ran through the small audience. Abigail kept her gaze steady, focused on Whitfield, refusing to show the anger his words provoked. "Miss Price has been observed in private conversations with Kendall during his visits to town," Whitfield continued. "She has exchanged correspondence with him of a personal nature. And most concerning of all, she has made arrangements to visit his remote ranch this weekend, staying overnight with only the most token of chaperonage." The murmurs grew louder. Whitfield raised his voice slightly to be heard over them. "I submit that such behavior is unbecoming of the person responsible for molding the minds and characters of our children. I therefore move that Miss Price be removed from her position, effective immediately, and a replacement sought who better exemplifies the values we wish to instill in the next generation." He sat down, his expression one of righteous satisfaction. Mayor Anderson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "Miss Price," he said, finally meeting her gaze, "these are serious allegations. Do you wish to respond?" Abigail rose to her feet, her heart pounding but her voice steady when she spoke. "I do, Mayor Anderson," she said clearly. "First, I must note that Mr. Whitfield has presented no evidence of impropriety, merely of association. I have indeed spoken with Mr. Kendall during his visits to town. I have corresponded with him. I had planned to visit his ranch in the company of a respectable chaperone, Miss Sarah Jensen, whose father sits on this very council." She paused, looking directly at Dr. Jensen, who nodded slightly in acknowledgement. "What Mr. Whitfield fails to mention," Abigail continued, "is that my interest in Mr. Kendall began when he saved my life last winter, finding me lost in a blizzard and sheltering me at his home until the storm passed. An act of heroism and kindness for which this town should be grateful, not suspicious." "We're all aware of that incident," Whitfield cut in impatiently. "The issue at hand is your continued association with the man, despite knowing his history and the community's judgment of his character." "Ah," Abigail said, turning to face him directly. "And that's the crux of the matter, isn't it, Mr. Whitfield? Not any actual impropriety on my part, but my refusal to conform to your judgment of who is and isn't acceptable company." She looked around at the other council members. "Or perhaps the real issue is my refusal of Mr. Whitfield's persistent attentions and marriage proposals." Whitfield's face flushed dark red. "That's irrelevant," he snapped, "and inappropriate to mention in this forum." "Is it?" Abigail countered. "You question my moral character publicly." "I think my motivation for associating with Mr. Kendall rather than yourself is entirely relevant." Before Whitfield could respond, the door at the back of the hall opened with a bang. All heads turned to see Kyle Kendall striding down the center aisle, his expression grim but controlled. He was dressed more formally than Abigail had ever seen him in a proper suit and tie, his hair neatly trimmed, his beard groomed. "I apologize for interrupting," he said as he reached the front of the hall, "but as my name and character are being discussed, I felt I had the right to be present." Mayor Anderson looked flustered by this unexpected development. "Mr. Kendall," he acknowledged uncertainly, "this is a town council meeting, not a public forum." "With all due respect, Mayor," Kyle replied evenly, "you made it public when you allowed an audience." He gestured to the gathered townspeople. "And when the topic of discussion is a woman's reputation, I believe the man whose association allegedly damages that reputation has a right to speak." There was a moment of uncomfortable silence as the council members exchanged glances. Finally, Dr. Jensen spoke up. "Let him speak," he said firmly. I, for one, would like to hear what Mr. Kendall has to say. Mayor Anderson hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. Very well, he conceded. You may address the council, Mr. Kendall. Kyle inclined his head in thanks, then moved to stand beside Abigail, a gesture of solidarity that sent a rush of warmth through her despite the tension of the moment. I understand that my past has been a source of speculation and concern in this community, he began, his deep voice carrying easily through the hall. Some of that concern is based on fact, some on misunderstanding, and some on deliberate distortion. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the council and the audience behind them. Yes, I lived with the Apache after leaving the army. I learned their language, their customs, their way of life. I came to respect their connection to this land and their right to live on it in peace. When tragedy struck, I left the territory for a time, then returned to build something new, a ranch that employs local men, pays local taxes, and contributes to the economy of this community. Kyle's voice grew more passionate as he continued. In the 8 years I've lived outside Hachita, I've never given any citizen cause for complaint. I've conducted my business honestly, respected the law, and kept largely to myself. Yet I've been judged and found wanting based on rumors and prejudice rather than my actions or character. He turned slightly toward Abigail, his expression softening. When I found Miss Price lost in that blizzard last winter, I did what any decent man would do. I brought her to safety. During the days we were snowed in together, I treated her with nothing but respect and propriety. Since then, our association has been conducted openly and honorably. There has been nothing inappropriate in our friendship, despite Mr. Whitfield's insinuations. Kyle faced the council again, his gaze settling on Whitfield with cool determination. The only impropriety I see here is the attempt to use Miss Price's position as leverage to control her personal associations. That speaks far more to Mr. Whitfield's character than to hers or mine. A murmur of agreement ran through the audience, and Abigail noticed several heads nodding. Whitfield surged to his feet, his face mottled with anger. "This is outrageous," he sputtered. "Kendall has no right to question my motives or character. He's not even a proper resident of this town." "I pay taxes here," Kyle pointed out calmly. "I vote here. I do business here." "By what definition am I not a resident?" "You know exactly what I mean," Whitfield said, his voice dropping dangerously. "You're an outsider, always have been, always will be. Your loyalty isn't to Hachita or its people." "My loyalty is to decency and fairness," Kyle replied, which appear to be in short supply at this particular meeting. Before Whitfield could respond, Jakob Mueller spoke up. "I've known Kyle Kendall for 8 years," he said, his German accent more pronounced than usual. "Done business with him regular. Never known him to be anything but honest and straightforward. Can't say as much for some others I could name." His gaze flicked meaningfully toward Whitfield, who bristled visibly. Dr. Jensen cleared his throat. "My daughter speaks highly of both Miss Price and Mr. Kendall," he added. "And Sarah's judgment is not easily swayed by gossip or prejudice." Martha Wilson, who had been watching the proceedings with an unreadable expression, finally spoke. "I believe we're straying from the matter at hand," she said primly. "The question is whether Miss Price's conduct, whatever its nature, has affected her ability to teach our children effectively." She turned to Abigail. "In the months you've been our teacher, Miss Price, has a single parent complained about your methods or dedication?" Abigail straightened. "Not to my knowledge, Mrs. Wilson," she answered truthfully. Martha nodded as if this confirmed something. "And have your personal associations interfered with your duties in any way, caused you to be late to school or unprepared or absent?" "Never," Abigail said firmly. Martha looked around at her fellow council members. "Then I fail to see the issue," she said with surprising finality. "A teacher's private life is their own affair, provided it doesn't affect their professional conduct or involve actual impropriety." She fixed Whitfield with a stern look. "Friendship, even correspondence, hardly constitutes impropriety, Thomas. Nor does a chaperoned visit to a gentleman's home, however. Unconventional the gentleman may be." Whitfield looked stunned by this unexpected opposition from a quarter he had clearly counted on for support. "But the moral example," he began. The moral example I wish set for my grandchildren, Martha interrupted firmly, is one of fairness, kindness, and judgment based on a person's actions rather than rumors or background. Her gaze softened slightly as it moved from Whitfield to Abigail and Kyle. And perhaps one of courage in the face of unjust criticism. A short silence followed this pronouncement. Then Mayor Anderson cleared his throat. "Well," he said, sounding relieved to have a clear direction, "I believe we should put the matter to a vote. Those in favor of retaining Miss Price as our schoolteacher for the fall term." Dr. Jensen's hand went up immediately, followed by Jakob Mueller's, and after a slight hesitation, Martha Wilson's. Mayor Anderson raised his own hand, making it 4 votes to 1. "The motion passes," he declared. "Miss Price will continue in her position." He banged his gavel with apparent relief. Meeting adjourned. Whitfield stood abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the wooden floor. Without a word to his fellow council members, he strode from the hall, shouldering past Kyle with deliberate force. The audience began to disperse, some pausing to speak quietly with one another, a few approaching Abigail with words of support or simply curious looks. Through it all, Kyle remained by her side, a solid presence that anchored her amid the swirl of emotions: relief, vindication, lingering anger at Whitfield's accusations, and beneath it all, a deep gratitude for the unexpected support from Martha Wilson and the others. When the hall had nearly emptied, Kyle finally spoke, his voice pitched for her ears alone. "Are you all right?" Abigail nodded, suddenly exhausted now that the tension had broken. "I think so," she said. "Thank you for coming. You didn't have to do that." Kyle's expression was serious. "Yes, I did," he said simply. "I couldn't let you face this alone, not when I was partly the cause of it." "Whitfield's jealousy was the cause," Abigail corrected, "not our friendship." A hint of a smile touched Kyle's lips at her deliberate use of the word friendship, mindful of the few remaining people within earshot. "Even so," he said, "I'm glad I was here." Before Abigail could respond, Martha Wilson approached them, her expression unreadable. "Miss Price," she said formally, "Mr. Kendall." They both turned to face her, Abigail steeling herself for whatever the older woman might say. To her surprise, Martha's severe expression softened slightly. "That was poorly handled on Thomas's part," she said, her voice lowered. "Whatever his feelings about certain matters, to attempt to publicly embarrass a lady is inexcusable." "Thank you for your support, Mrs. Wilson," Abigail said sincerely. "It was unexpected but very much appreciated." Martha sniffed dismissively. "I'm not saying I approve of everything," she clarified, "but I've watched you these past months, Miss Price. You've been nothing but dedicated to your students and respectful of this community's ways, even when they differ from what you're accustomed to." She glanced at Kyle. "And you, Mr. Kendall, spoke well tonight, better than many expected." Kyle inclined his head slightly. "Thank you, madam," he said, his tone respectful. "I've had little opportunity to address the town directly before now." "Perhaps that has been to everyone's detriment," Martha observed thoughtfully. "Silence allows rumors to flourish." She straightened, her manner becoming brisk once more. "In any case, the matter is settled for now. Miss Price will continue as our teacher, and what she does with her free time is her own affair, provided she maintains appropriate discretion." With that parting advice, Martha departed, leaving Abigail and Kyle alone in the nearly empty hall. For a moment, they simply stood together, absorbing the events of the evening and what they might mean for the future. "What now?" Abigail asked finally, looking up at Kyle. His blue eyes were thoughtful as they met hers. "That depends," he said, "on what you want, Abigail. Tonight changes nothing about the challenges we would face. Whitfield won't forget this defeat easily, and not everyone in town will be as understanding as Mrs. Wilson unexpectedly proved to be." "I know," Abigail acknowledged, "but I also know what I want, and that hasn't changed." She took a deep breath, gathering her courage. "I want a chance to see if what's between us could grow into something lasting, something worth fighting for." Kyle's expression softened, a vulnerability appearing that he rarely allowed others to see. "I want that too," he admitted quietly. "More than I've wanted anything in a very long time, but I need to be sure you understand what you're choosing. My life is not an easy one. My ranch is remote, the work demanding, and my past." He hesitated. My past will always be a part of me. I wouldn't want it otherwise, Abigail said firmly. Your past shaped the man you are just as mine shaped me. I don't fear it, Kyle. I only ask that you share it with me as I'll share mine with you. Kyle studied her face for a long moment, as if memorizing every feature. You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known, he said finally, echoing the words he had spoken in the garden the night of the dance. And if you're certain this is what you want, then I am yours today, tomorrow, for as long as you'll have me. The simple declaration, spoken with such quiet intensity, filled Abigail with a joy so profound it brought tears to her eyes. Then I suppose, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion threatening to overwhelm her, we should make plans for that visit to your ranch. I believe I still have a chaperone willing to accompany me. Kyle's smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. I believe you do, he agreed, and I find I'm suddenly very much looking forward to showing you my home. The journey to Kyle's ranch the following Saturday was filled with a sense of anticipation and new beginnings. Sarah Jensen proved an ideal traveling companion, cheerful, practical, and tactfully oblivious to the meaningful glances Abigail and Kyle exchanged as the wagon rumbled across the rugged landscape. The ranch itself was a revelation to Abigail. Far from the primitive cabin she half remembered from her rescue, Kyle's home was a well-established property with a main house built of solid timber and stone, several outbuildings, corrals for horses, and grazing land stretching toward distant mountains. A small orchard of apple and peach trees stood near the house, and a kitchen garden flourished with late summer vegetables. It's beautiful, Abigail breathed as they approached. You've built all this yourself, Kyle, riding alongside the wagon, nodded. With help, he said. Miguel has been with me almost from the beginning, and there are usually a few hands around during busy seasons. But yes, most of it is my work. Pride was evident in his voice, and Abigail found herself seeing the ranch through his eyes not just as a place of work or shelter, but as a testament to his vision and perseverance, a life carved from the wilderness through sheer determination. The day passed in a whirl of new experiences as Kyle showed Abigail and Sarah around the property. They toured the barns and corrals, where Kyle's prize horses regarded them with intelligent curiosity. They visited the small bunkhouse where the ranch hands stayed when needed, currently empty as Kyle had given his men the weekend off in anticipation of their visit. They walked along the creek that provided water for the ranch, its banks shaded by willows and cottonwoods. Throughout it all, Kyle was a different man than the reserved, cautious figure Abigail had known in town. Here, on his own land, he was confident and at ease, his passion for the ranch and its operations evident in every word and gesture. He spoke of his plans for expansion, the challenges of ranching in the arid climate, the satisfaction of seeing his efforts bear fruit year after year. In the evening, they shared a meal that Kyle had prepared himself, a stew of beef and vegetables from his garden, with fresh bread that Miguel's wife had baked that morning, before departing for her sister's home in a nearby settlement. The food was simple but delicious, and the conversation flowed easily around the table in the main room of Kyle's house. The house itself was another surprise, larger and more comfortable than Abigail had expected, with solid furniture, some of it clearly handcrafted, and touches that spoke of a refined sensibility. Shelves of well-worn books, a few carefully preserved paintings, even a small piano in one corner that Kyle admitted with some embarrassment he was teaching himself to play. My mother insisted on music lessons when I was a boy, he explained, said it civilized the spirit. I didn't appreciate it then, but out here in the quiet of evening, it reminds me of home. After dinner, true to her role as chaperone but with a conspiratorial wink at Abigail, Sarah declared herself exhausted and retired to the small guest room Kyle had prepared for the women. Left alone in the main room, Abigail and Kyle moved to sit before the hearth, where a small fire warded off the evening chill. For a time, they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the flames dance. Then Kyle spoke, his voice soft in the quiet room. I never thought I'd have this, he said, not looking at her but at the fire. Someone to share this place with, someone who might see it as I do. Abigail reached across the space between them, taking his hand in hers. I'm beginning to, she said. It's not just a ranch, is it? It's a testament. A statement. Kyle's fingers tightened around hers. Yes, he acknowledged. A statement that it's possible to build something worthwhile even after loss, that the past doesn't have to define the future. Tell me about them, Abigail said gently. Neonoka and Tarak. They were part of what made you who you are. I'd like to know them through your memories. Kyle was silent for so long that Abigail thought he might refuse, but then he began to speak, haltingly at first, then with growing ease. He told her of Neonoka's strength and wisdom, her skills as a healer, her fierce love for her son. He spoke of Tarak's curiosity and intelligence, his quick laughter, his way of seeing the world with wonder. He'd be a young man now, Kyle said, his voice tinged with a grief that time had softened but never erased. 17, perhaps 18, I've often wondered what became of him, if he survived the reservation, if he remembers me. Perhaps someday you'll find out, Abigail suggested. The world has a way of bringing people back together when it's meant to be. Kyle glanced at her, a hint of a smile touching his lips. As it brought us together in a blizzard, he asked. Abigail nodded, smiling in return. Exactly so, she agreed. Though I'd prefer any future reunions to involve less risk of freezing to death. Kyle laughed softly, the sound warming Abigail more than the fire. Agreed, he said. Then, more seriously, you know that if we continue this, if we build a life together, there will always be those who disapprove. Who judge us based on the past rather than the present. I know, Abigail said, and I don't care, not if it means being with you. Kyle studied her face in the firelight, his expression one of wonder and gratitude. I've never known anyone like you, he said softly. So certain, so brave. Not brave, Abigail corrected. Just clear about what matters, who matters. She squeezed his hand. And you matter to me, Kyle Kendall, more than I can express. The distance between them seemed suddenly unbearable. With a gentle tug, Kyle drew her closer until she was seated beside him on the small sofa, her hand still clasped in his. Abigail, he said, her name a caress on his lips. I love you. I think I have since that first moment in the snow, though I was too stubborn to admit it even to myself. Joy bloomed in Abigail's chest, bright and fierce. I love you too, she said, the words coming easily, naturally, as if she had been waiting all her life to speak them to this man. With all my heart. Kyle's free hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle as a whisper. May I kiss you? He asked, echoing her question from the night of the dance. In answer, Abigail leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their lips met in a kiss that began tenderly but quickly deepened, expressing all the longing and love that had grown between them over the months of separation and constraint. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Kyle rested his forehead against hers. Marry me, he said simply. Not tomorrow or next week. Take the time you need to be sure, but say you'll be my wife, Abigail. Say you'll share this life with me. Abigail's heart soared at the words she had hardly dared hope to hear. Yes, she said without hesitation. Yes, I'll marry you, Kyle. I don't need time to be sure. My heart is already decided. The joy that illuminated Kyle's face in that moment was something Abigail knew she would remember for the rest of her life, pure, unguarded happiness that transformed his features and seemed to light him from within. He kissed her again, briefly but with a promise of all that was to come, then drew back slightly. We should probably maintain some propriety, he said reluctantly. For Sarah's sake, if nothing else. Abigail nodded, though she made no move to increase the distance between them. We should, she agreed, though I suspect Sarah would be the first to congratulate us on our engagement. The word sent a thrill through her engagement. They were to be married, to build a life together on this land that Kyle had reclaimed from wilderness, to face whatever challenges came their way as partners, equals in love and determination. As if reading her thoughts, Kyle smiled, his expression one of wonder and gratitude. I found you in the snow, he said softly, half frozen but fighting with every breath. I wrapped you in my coat and brought you home, never imagining that in saving you, I was saving myself as well. Abigail leaned against him, resting her head on his shoulder as they watched the fire together. content in the knowledge that they had found in each other something rare and precious, a love born in the midst of a blizzard, tested by prejudice and opposition, and emerging stronger for having weathered the storm. Epilogue: 5 years later, the spring sun filtered through the cottonwood trees surrounding Kyle and Abigail Kendall's ranch, casting dappled shadows across the yard where their 3-year-old son, James, was attempting to help his father repair a section of fence. The boy's dark hair, so like his father's, fell across his forehead as he solemnly handed Kyle tools from a carefully arranged row on the ground. From the porch of the expanded ranch house, Abigail watched them with a smile, one hand resting on her swollen belly where their second child, a daughter, according to Dr. Jensen's prediction, was due to arrive within the month. Beside her in a rocking chair sat Martha Wilson, now a frequent visitor to the ranch despite her advancing years and the journey from Hachita. "He's the very image of his father," Martha observed, following Abigail's gaze to where Kyle was patiently showing James how to hold a hammer properly. "But he has your determination, I think." Abigail laughed softly. "A dangerous combination, according to Kyle," she said. "He claims James will either build an empire or tear down the barn trying." Martha's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Children have a way of combining the best and most challenging traits of both parents," she agreed. "It's nature's way of keeping us humble." The years had softened Martha considerably, particularly after Thomas Whitfield had left Hachita following a failed attempt to have Kyle's water rights revoked, an effort that backfired when evidence emerged of Whitfield's own dubious business practices. Martha had been among the first to congratulate Abigail and Kyle on their engagement, surprising everyone with her declaration that it was about time someone in this town married for love rather than convenience. Their wedding, held in the schoolhouse with Dr. Jensen officiating, had been attended by most of the town, a testament to how perceptions had shifted once people were given the opportunity to know Kyle as more than a subject of rumor and speculation. Abigail had continued teaching for another year after their marriage, before retiring to focus on the ranch, and later, their growing family. The ranch itself had prospered under their joint management. Kyle's knowledge of the land and livestock, combined with Abigail's organizational skills and education, had allowed them to expand operations, hire more permanent hands, and even experiment with new crops suited to the arid climate. The library Kyle had started had grown to fill an entire room of the house, and music regularly filled their evenings, Kyle at the piano, Abigail singing, and increasingly, James attempting to join in with his own interpretations. Life was not without its challenges. The harsh realities of ranching in the Southwest meant periods of drought and hardship, conflicts with neighboring landowners over resources, and the constant work required to maintain their home and livelihood. But together, they faced each obstacle with the same determination that had brought them together in that fateful blizzard 5 years earlier. As Abigail watched, Kyle lifted James onto his shoulders, pointing toward the mountains that bounded their property to the east. The boys' delighted laughter carried across the yard, a sound that never failed to warm Abigail's heart. "You've built something remarkable here," Martha said quietly, following Abigail's gaze. "Not just the ranch, but the life, the family." Abigail nodded, her hand moving gently over her belly as the baby within shifted position. "We have," she agreed. "Though sometimes I still can't quite believe it's real, that all of this grew from those days in the snow." Martha's expression grew thoughtful. "Some of life's greatest blessings come disguised as disasters," she observed. "It takes wisdom to recognize them for what they truly are." Before Abigail could respond, Kyle and James were approaching the porch, the boy still perched on his father's shoulders, tiny hands tangled in Kyle's dark hair. "Mama," James called excitedly. "Papa showed me the eagle's nest way up high, did he now?" Abigail replied with a smile. "And did you see the eagle?" James nodded vigorously. "She was flying, big wings." He spread his arms to demonstrate, nearly overbalancing before Kyle steadied him with practiced ease. "Careful, Cowboy," Kyle said, lifting the boy down from his shoulders. "Why don't you show Mrs. Wilson that interesting rock you found yesterday?" "It's in the basket by the door." As James eagerly complied, Kyle moved to Abigail's side, his hand coming to rest protectively over hers on her belly. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his voice low with concern. "We're fine," Abigail assured him, leaning into his solid warmth. "Your daughter is just restless today. Like her brother, she never seems to sleep when she should." Kyle's smile was tender as he bent to press a kiss to her temple. "Also like her mother," he teased gently. "Always too busy thinking to rest," Abigail laughed, acknowledging the truth of his observation. "I was thinking about the blizzard," she admitted, "about how close I came to giving up that day." Kyle's arm tightened around her shoulders. Even after 5 years, the memory of finding her in the snow, so close to surrendering to the cold, could still send a chill through him. "But you didn't," he said. "You kept walking. You survived. Because you found me," Abigail said simply. "Because you wrapped me in your coat and your promise." Kyle's eyes, still that striking blue that had first captured her attention, grew serious as they met hers. "Best promise I ever made," he said softly, "and I intend to keep it for all our days." As James returned with his precious rock, chattering excitedly to Martha about its special powers, Abigail leaned into her husband's embrace, surrounded by the family and home they had built together. Beyond the yard, the land stretched toward the horizon, no longer a wilderness to be feared, but a domain they had claimed through love and labor. The blizzard that had nearly claimed her life had instead given her everything she had ever truly wanted, not just survival, but a life worth living, a love worth fighting for, a future built on shared dreams and promises kept. And as the afternoon sun bathed their home in golden light, Abigail knew with absolute certainty that no matter what storms might lie ahead, they would weather them together, wrapped in the warmth of the love that had found them both when they needed it most.